I was halfway through correcting a shipment variance that would have triggered a vendor penalty when Wade motioned for me to come in. No agenda, no warning, just a quick wave, like I was being called to confirm a number. He didn't offer a seat. "We've found someone better than you." The sentence landed before I could even close the door. No build-up, no explanation, just a clean execution, delivered in a steady voice that suggested this had already been rehearsed, maybe even enjoyed. Wade smiled, polite and contained, as if this were a routine update and not the removal of a human being. He framed it as efficiency, cost reduction, strategic alignment. The role, he said, had stabilized. Anyone competent could handle it now. He said that last part with confidence, the kind that comes from never having done the work himself. I've spent 10 years inside this operation, building systems no one bothered to understand as long as the numbers stayed green. I didn't manage chaos, I prevented it. I knew which vendors broke under pressure, which ones needed personal calls, which shipments could not be delayed without consequences that wouldn't show up for months. I was the reason problems never reached executives. Silence was my success metric. Wade arrived less than 2 years ago, armed with slides and buzzwords. He spoke fluently about outcomes, not processes. He loved summaries, hated questions, and treated detail like a nuisance. In meetings, he liked to say things ran smoothly now, as if smoothness were accidental, as if it didn't cost someone nights, weekends, and years of accumulated judgment. "This is just business," he added, sliding a thin folder across the desk. "No discussion of severance, no timeline, just instructions document what I do, clear my area, and make the transition easy." He thanked me. Actually, thanked me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I stood, nodded once, and walked out with shock pressing hard against my ribs, quickly followed by something colder. Not sadness, disrespect. Halfway back to my desk, it hit me. The timing wasn't coincidence. Today was Thursday. The regional performance review was Monday, the one I'd quietly carried for a decade. Wade had fired the foundation 2 days before the inspection, and he thought he'd cut costs. If you're listening right now, take a second and check in with yourself. How are you holding up today? Maybe pause. Take a slow breath in through your nose. Let it out gently, and remind yourself to drink a little water when you can. Small things matter more than we think. Tell me where you're listening from. I always like knowing these stories are keeping someone company. And if this moment already feels familiar to you, stay with me and subscribe quietly. Because what happens next is where the real pressure begins. I didn't build the system all at once. It took 10 years of fixing what everyone else stepped around. When I started, nothing matched the reports. Inventory sat where it didn't belong. Vendors argued over numbers, and deadlines slipped quietly until someone yelled. I learned the chaos by living inside it. I stayed late when trucks arrived wrong. I came in early when forecasts broke. I memorized patterns no software tracked, yet seasonal pressure points, unreliable suppliers, fragile timelines. When something failed, my name never appeared. When something worked, it was the system. That phrase followed me for years. Wade loved it in meetings. He leaned back and told executives, "The system runs itself now." He said it proudly, like progress had happened naturally. No mention of the nights I slept with my phone on my chest, or the mornings I walked in already exhausted. I protected people below me because someone had to. When a junior coordinator misrouted a shipment, I fixed it before management noticed. When a warehouse supervisor panicked, I absorbed the blame and taught him quietly. Mistakes didn't disappear, they were contained. That containment became invisible labor. Over time, my role stopped having a name. I wasn't leadership. I wasn't support. I was labeled overhead. A line item justified only because replacing me felt risky, as long as the numbers stayed green. No one asked why. Wade never asked how the system worked. He asked for summaries, decks, and clean charts. I delivered them because accuracy mattered. Each report stripped context until complexity looked simple. The simpler it looked, the easier it was to dismiss, looking back. The irony is how stable everything appeared from the outside. Auditors stopped asking questions. Vendors trusted our timelines. Executives praised consistency without curiosity. Stability became proof that no one needed to look closer. I learned that reliability is rewarded with silence. You don't get credit for disasters that never happen. Each quarter. I prepared the numbers Wade presented upstairs. He spoke confidently about efficiency gains while I watched faces nod. No one asked who corrected the data at midnight. No one wondered why certain risks never surfaced. My contribution stayed nameless by design. By the time Wade decided I was replaceable, the story had already been rewritten. In his version, the system existed first, and I merely occupied a seat. That narrative made the cut feel reasonable. It made my decade of work sound like maintenance instead of creation. And maintenance, he believed, should be cheap. That belief set the stage for everything that followed next afterward. Then came the afternoon he called a transition. Wade stood by my desk and said it casually, smiling, "Before you leave, write everything down for your replacement." Everything. I asked how much time I had. He checked his watch. "The end of the day should be enough," he said. He reminded me I'd always said the system was straightforward. I hadn't. He had. That was the moment the unfairness sharpened into something heavier. 10 years of judgment, relationships, and failures compressed into an afternoon assignment. Not because it was possible, but because admitting otherwise would mean admitting I mattered. And that was the one thing he refused to do. I sat down and opened a blank document because that was what I'd been told to do. Write it all out, make it easy. At first, I tried. I listed vendors by name, then paused. Realizing names meant nothing without history. I wrote delivery schedules, then stopped. Because the real schedule lived in my head, the one that adjusted automatically when weather shifted, when factories slowed, when certain suppliers quietly cut corners. I typed process steps, then deleted them, because the steps only worked if you knew when to ignore them. That was when the cold clarity set in. This wasn't information, it was judgment. 10 years of trial, error, and consequence compressed into instincts that triggered before alarms ever did. You couldn't hand that to someone in an afternoon any more than you could hand them muscle memory and expect it to work. I kept writing anyway, but differently. I reduced everything to the bare minimum what policy required, not what reality demanded. Contact lists without context, process outlines without exceptions, timelines without contingencies. Enough to say I complied. Not enough to pretend I transferred something that had never lived on paper. I wasn't being cruel. I wasn't being generous either. I was being accurate. Wade walked past once and asked how it was going. "Almost done," I said. He nodded, satisfied, already convinced he'd solved the problem. He thought knowledge behaved like files: copy, paste, replace. I didn't argue. There was no point. I noticed something strange as the hours passed. I wasn't angry anymore. The hurt had cooled into something quieter and sharper. Control. For the first time that day. I understood exactly where my power had always been. Not in my title. Not in approval. In what couldn't be separated from me. No matter how small they tried to make my role look. When I finished, the document was thin. Intentionally so. I saved it. Emailed it to Wade, and shut down my computer. No drama, no announcement, just completion. As I packed my bag, I found myself thinking about a standing appointment I hadn't canceled yet. Every few months, I met for coffee with the regional director, Wade's boss's boss. It wasn't official. It never was. Years ago, during a compliance incident involving a junior employee, I'd argued against destroying someone's career over a single mistake. Everyone expected me to stay quiet. He remembered that, after that. He checked in. Not about metrics, about operations, about pressure points, about people. He was the only executive who ever asked me how things actually worked. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. Late afternoon. The usual time, for a moment. I considered canceling. It felt awkward now, irrelevant. Maybe. I was already gone. Then I realized something else. Wade hadn't fired me in isolation. He'd done it without understanding the timing, the dependencies, or who paid attention to what. That meeting wasn't small talk. It was part of a system too, one he'd never bothered to learn. I left the building without looking back and drove home. My thoughts steady, unemotional. This wasn't defeat. It was exposure. And exposure always travels upward faster than people expect. That evening, as I set the thin folder of notes aside, a quiet lesson settled in one I didn't need to write down because I already understood it. Real leverage isn't loud, and it isn't assigned. It comes from being the difference between order and collapse, especially when no one notices until it's gone. My phone stayed silent for a while after that. I didn't rush to fill the space. I let it breathe. Because when systems lose what holds them together, the first thing they do is look up the chain. And when that call finally came, it wouldn't be about paperwork. If you're really paying attention, you'll notice why this changes everything. Did you catch it? The call came while I was standing in my kitchen, staring at a mug I hadn't touched. The day still felt unfinished, like a sentence cut short in the middle. "Tracy," a calm voice said, controlled but tight. "Why weren't you at the regional review today?" I recognized him immediately. He was Wade's superior, 2 levels up the chain, the one who chaired the quarterly evaluations, the one whose meetings Wade never missed, for a moment. I didn't answer, not because I was confused, but because I understood something had already shifted. That question wasn't curiosity. It was disruption. I wasn't invited. I said evenly, "Wade terminated my position this morning." Silence followed. Not the polite pause people use to think, but the kind that stretches when an assumption collapses. I could hear faint voices in the background, the low hum of a conference room where schedules had already been set, roles already assigned without me. He did what the voice finally asked. The tone was different now, sharper, alert. He said they'd found someone better. I replied, "And cheaper." Another long silence. I imagined eyes lifting from papers, someone gesturing for the room to hold. Whatever Wade had explained to them earlier wasn't aligning with this version. For the first time that day, my absence had weight. "You're listed as lead contributor on the review," he said slowly. "You've always been, I know." I answered. I was planning to attend. Until this morning. There was a breath on the other end. Measured but heavy. I could almost hear the recalculation happening. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about process, about exposure, about how a critical role could vanish hours before a high-stakes review without anyone above Wade knowing. "I need you to stay available," he said. "Don't go anywhere." The line went dead. I set my phone down and waited. I didn't feel relief. I felt distance. The story was no longer mine to carry alone. It had entered a larger system, one with rules Wade had ignored. 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, it was HR. The woman introduced herself carefully, as if each word needed permission before leaving her mouth. She asked me to confirm my employee number, then the time of my meeting with Wade, then the reason given for my termination. I answered plainly, no emotion, just facts. "I'm reviewing the file now," she said. I heard typing, then a pause. Then more typing, faster this time. "Did Mr. Brennan provide you with formal documentation?" she asked. "No." "Severance details?" "No." "Written cause, performance citations?" He said cost reduction. The silence returned, but this time it was procedural. I knew that sound. It was the sound of a checklist failing quietly. "Thank you for confirming," she said at last. "Please remain reachable." When the call ended, I leaned back against the counter and exhaled for the first time all day. Not because I felt saved, because I felt seen from above. An hour later, Wade called. His voice was different now, strained, controlled too tightly. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said. "We need to talk." I let him speak. The termination wasn't properly authorized. He continued. "HR flagged it. The review, it created confusion. We need you back immediately. Back, not respected, not acknowledged. Back. Like a misplaced tool returned to its drawer." "What about the person who was better?" I asked. A pause. Shorter this time. "That didn't work out." He said, "Look, this was a judgment error. It happens. Not to him." It didn't. "Until now. I'll think about it," I replied, and ended the call before he could regain momentum. I stood there afterward, phone still warm in my hand, aware of the quiet reversal unfolding. Wade thought power lived in authority, in signatures, in confidence. But authority only worked when it aligned with structure, and structure had just noticed it was missing a load-bearing piece. I hadn't argued. I hadn't demanded anything. I hadn't needed to. The call had already done the work, somewhere above Wade. The story was being retold this time without his edits, and once power starts moving upward, it doesn't stop to ask permission from the person who caused the shift. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing with certainty. The system had started asking questions. Wade called just after sunset, when the day had settled into that quiet space where decisions feel heavier than they did in daylight. I recognized the number immediately and let it ring once longer than necessary before answering. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, and the confidence I'd heard all morning was gone. His voice was tighter, cautious, shaped by conversations I hadn't been part of. "You need to come back. Immediately." I didn't respond. He kept talking, filling the silence the way people do when they realize they no longer control the pace. HR, he explained, had flagged the termination. Approvals hadn't been aligned. The timing had been unfortunate. Words like alignment and unfortunate replaced better and cheaper. Language adjusts quickly when authority slips. I stayed quiet. Listening. Silence. I was learning. Had become my most effective position. "Tracy," he added. Softer now. "This is fixable. We value your role." Value was a new word. It sounded unfamiliar coming from him, like he was borrowing it for the occasion. I didn't agree. I didn't refuse. I let the space remain empty between us, because that space now belonged to me. Wade mistook it for indecision. It wasn't. It was control. He tried again. The review had gone poorly without me. Questions had surfaced he couldn't answer. Dependencies he hadn't known existed suddenly mattered. He said my presence would stabilize things. He said it would help everyone. When he paused, waiting, I still said nothing. The call ended with him promising to follow up soon. His urgency exposed in the way he rushed the goodbye. An hour later, the truth arrived without effort. A message came from someone in operations, brief and almost apologetic. The replacement had lasted less than half a day. Apparently, the job wasn't what he'd been told. He'd expected oversight, not responsibility. Reports, not consequences. He walked out quietly, leaving behind an unanswered list of questions and a system he didn't recognize. I reread the message once, then set my phone down. The irony was precise. Wade had believed competence was transferable because the work looked calm. He'd mistaken absence of noise for absence of complexity. The person he'd chosen was qualified on paper, fluent in the language Wade respected. But language didn't move freight, didn't calm vendors, didn't catch small errors before they multiplied. Later that night, Wade called again. "This is getting serious," he said, abandoning pretense. "Things are backing up. People are confused. I need you. Not the system, not the documentation. Me." I let the quiet stretch longer this time. I thought about the years I'd absorbed pressure, so it never reached him. About how easy it had been for him to believe he could replace me because he'd never felt what I carried. I thought about how quickly the structure bent without resistance once my weight was removed. "I'll let you know," I said finally. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't leverage. It was simply the truth. After the call ended, I sat still, aware of the shift settling into place. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't negotiated. I hadn't demanded recognition. I had done something far more effective. I had allowed the consequences to speak first. By the end of the night, Wade understood something he'd never learned in business school. Authority isn't power if it outruns understanding, and control doesn't come from making decisions quickly, but from knowing when to stop making them at all. The mistake was official now, and it no longer belonged to me. The first call came early the next morning, before the day had fully decided what it was going to become. A warehouse supervisor spoke fast, words tripping over each other. A shipment of temperature-sensitive goods had been sent to the wrong location. The system showed it was correct. Reality didn't agree. I gave him a short answer where to reroute it, who to notify, and hung up before he could ask anything else. I told myself it would stop there. It didn't. By mid-morning, my phone had become a quiet emergency line. A vendor called asking why an order had doubled without notice. Another wanted to know why their delivery window had shifted by 2 weeks. Someone from logistics left a message saying trucks were waiting for instructions that no longer existed. I answered selectively, briefly, enough to prevent collapse, not enough to restore balance. Each response was precise, stripped of explanation. I wasn't solving problems anymore. I was slowing damage. Wade called before lunch. "This is spiraling," he said, skipping greetings. "Nothing is lining up. Reports say one thing, the floor shows another. That was always the first sign. When the reports stop matching the ground, the system has lost its translator." He tried to regain control by issuing directives. Move inventory, freeze orders, escalate everything. The more he pushed, the worse it became. Without understanding sequence, urgency only creates noise. Another vendor called me directly that afternoon. We'd worked together for years. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention Wade. He just said, "I don't know who's in charge anymore." That sentence carried weight. I gave him a minimal answer, enough to keep the relationship intact without stepping back into it fully. When I hung up, I felt the tension rise not inside me, but around me. The system was reacting exactly as it always did when decisions outpaced knowledge. By the end of the day, Wade sounded exhausted. His voice had lost its edge, replaced by strain. He asked me questions he'd never bothered to ask before. Why certain items couldn't be stored together. Why some suppliers needed personal calls instead of automated notices. Why timelines slipped when everything looked correct on paper. I didn't explain. I answered only what was asked, never what was implied. There's a lesson I learned in that space. Watching everything tighten without snapping. Helping doesn't always mean fixing. Sometimes it means allowing reality to remain visible. If I stepped in fully, the narrative would reset. Wade would regain the illusion of control. The system would appear to run itself again. I wasn't interested in illusions anymore. Late that evening, a message came from someone higher up, brief, neutral. They were monitoring the situation. That phrase signaled a shift. Monitoring meant attention. Attention meant accountability. The next morning, Wade didn't call. That absence said more than his panic ever had. He was no longer the center of the response. He was the subject of it. When the call finally came, it wasn't from him. It was from his superior, measured and formal. He thanked me for remaining reachable. He acknowledged the disruption. Then he said something that reframed everything. "We're making a temporary structural adjustment." He explained. Effective immediately. Wade would retain his title, but responsibility for all operational decisions would now sit directly with him. No buffers, no intermediaries, no quiet corrections happening out of sight. Every outcome would trace back to a single name. The decision was described as support. I recognized it as exposure. After the call ended, I sat quietly, feeling the tension release just enough to breathe. I hadn't orchestrated this. I hadn't requested it. I'd simply stepped aside and allowed the system to respond honestly. Within hours, the calls slowed, not because things were improving, but because escalation had found its destination. The pressure had moved upward, where it belonged. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt steady. The system hadn't attacked Wade. It had done something far more precise. It had removed the illusion that decisions could be made without consequence. And for the first time since I was fired, the weight wasn't on me anymore. If you're listening closely, you already know what's coming next. Don't you? I heard about Wade's promotion the next morning from someone who still worked on the floor. The word promotion landed strangely, like a joke told without a smile. He was being elevated, officially, but stripped of every cushion that had protected him before. All operational responsibility now sat with him alone. On paper, it sounded like trust. In practice, it was exposure. Wade would oversee all warehouses directly. No deputies, no buffers, no quiet hands fixing things after hours. Every approval, every delay, every failure would route through his name. The system he'd once described as simple had been placed squarely on his desk. I imagined the meeting where it was announced. The careful language, the nods, the subtle relief from people who finally knew where accountability lived. Wade must have smiled, thinking the title mattered. Titles always mattered to him. Within days, the cracks widened, without intermediaries. Problems arrived unfiltered. Vendors escalated directly. Supervisors stopped softening their reports. There was no one left to absorb mistakes quietly. Wade was forced to confront the details he'd avoided for years. He called me once, late in the afternoon. "They're expecting answers I don't have," he said, frustration leaking through restraint. "Everyone keeps saying you used to handle this." I reminded him gently that anyone competent could manage it now. He didn't laugh. What surprised me wasn't his struggle. It was how quickly his own words turned into a trap. Each decision he made echoed his earlier confidence. If the system ran itself, then why was he working past midnight if the role was straightforward? Why did every solution create two new problems? Mistakes accumulated with names attached. A misrouted shipment, a missed deadline, a vendor pause that cost real money. Each incident followed a clear trail upward. For the first time, consequences didn't disappear into abstraction. People began documenting everything. Emails grew longer. Confirmations multiplied. No one wanted to be blamed for something Wade insisted was easy. The protection I'd once provided through quiet correction was gone, and the organization adjusted accordingly. I didn't interfere. I didn't comment. I watched from a distance as the narrative corrected itself. There's a specific kind of justice in watching someone inhabit their own assumptions. Wade had built his authority on the idea that complexity was exaggerated. Now, complexity answered directly to him, daily and without apology. One evening, he left a voicemail. His voice was tired, stripped of polish. I didn't realize how much was involved. He admitted, "It looked simple when you did it." That sentence stayed with me. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement. Arriving too late to change anything. Understanding. Delayed. Has limited power. The promotion held. The responsibility remained. No one stepped in to rescue him. That was the condition. He'd argued the system didn't need special handling, so none was provided.